Hey everybody, I hope you're keeping warm this winter. The last week or so up here in northern Minnesota, it has been frigid cold. Now, Minnesota is known for having pretty cold winters, but this has been exceptional. It's been negative 20 typically at night and negative 10 during the daytime. So, gone through a bit of a cold snap, but fortunately we have this wood stove which has been keeping us warm. We've been heating with wood heat for the last couple of years, so I thought I would share with you some of my ideas about wood stoves and the different choices that you could pursue, and the advantages and disadvantages of each of them. Now, I'm a big fan of the wood pellet stove. I think it's probably the most economical choice. And so let's talk about the different ways you could heat with wood and some of the pluses and minuses. Well, the easiest might be to just throw some wood in the fireplace and use the fireplace. But that's not very efficient because a lot of the heat from a fire in the fireplace just goes straight up the chimney. So compared to a wood stove, the fireplace is not going to be very efficient, and you're going to burn a lot of wood for the amount of heat that you receive from it. Now, I think fireplaces are awesome. I think they're cozy and they really add atmosphere, but as a heating appliance, not my first choice. Another choice you could do is an outdoor wood boiler system, but that's a pretty significant and costly adventure, and they consume a whole lot of wood. They're efficient, they put off a tremendous amount of heat, but a tremendous amount of heat also means a lot of wood, and so that's a pretty serious commitment. Now, I think a lot of folks are probably considering getting a standard wood stove for some supplemental heating or for some inexpensive heating. And there's two major paths you can go down: a traditional wood stove or a pellet stove. And they both have their advantages and disadvantages. A traditional wood stove is a pretty simple machine. It's a metal box that you put fire in, and it gets hot and it heats up your room. And the advantage is that you can put in any old piece of wood that fits into that firebox. And so if you harvest your own trees, that's kind of a no-brainer. And the cost of the wood for that kind of stove is the lowest cost. The stove also gets hot pretty fast. You can stoke up a fire in there, and within an hour or so, your space is probably getting pretty cozy. They're a bit more dangerous because you can't just touch the outer surface of a standard wood stove. They get very hot. And they're not really well controlled. That is, you control how hot it is by how much wood you put in the stove and how you adjust the airflow settings. And you find yourself making a big fire, which probably makes your room a little warmer than you need it to be. You let that die down, then you shove in more wood later, and you go through this kind of heat-cool cycle as you maintain the stove. You also have to be attentive to it. You have to be there to throw some more wood in every once in a while to keep the stove going. Now, because they heat up so rapidly, I think it's a great choice for places where you just occasionally need a little bit more warmth. Like maybe you have a shop behind the house and you want to be able to go out to the shop, start up the fire, and work out there for the afternoon or evening. But if you have more long-term needs, you want to use the wood stove as a general supplement to your heating, I think a pellet stove is really the way to go, and I think the pellet stove actually turns out to be easier and less expensive to operate. The pellet stove, of course, uses bags of pellets, and most of us can't produce our own pellets, so that's going to be a product you're going to have to buy. And buying a 40-pound bag of pellets is going to be just a little bit more expensive than 40 pounds of split firewood. And of course, you could also just harvest your own firewood, but that's not completely free either because you need to purchase a lot of tools to do that. Maybe you need a truck to move the wood around with. You probably need a chainsaw and an axe to split the wood, or a wood splitter, and all of this stuff is expensive. And not to mention, it's a lot of work processing firewood. So if you count that your labor's worth anything, well, you have to factor that in as well. So the pellets for a pellet stove is probably going to be the most expensive way to buy wood by a little bit. But in the end, I think it ends up being a lot less expensive than any other method. Now, some of the pluses is that handling a 40-pound bag of pellets, well, it's 40 pounds, but it's not that difficult. They're easy to handle. Whereas handling 40 pounds of split firewood, that's got rough edges on it and it's dirty, and you're probably digging through a wood pile that has insects and critters in it. And so you're dragging in a lot more debris into the house with split wood. Whereas bags of pellets tend to be pretty clean, tend to be pretty easy to handle. Now, when you put the bag of pellets into the stove, they're fed into the fire via an auger. And the auger is electronically controlled. So the pellet stove does require electricity. It requires electricity to run that auger system, to run the control system that is driving the auger, and to run the fans in the stove that move the hot air around into the room, and provide a fan that provides air into the firebox to control the fire. So it's a bit of a high-tech machine that is electronically controlled. Our wood stove uses about 100 to 200 watts of electricity. Now, of course, it puts off a whole lot more heat than 100 watts worth of electrical heat would provide, but it requires about 100 watts of electricity to operate the stove itself. Because the fuel is augered in on an electric motor, you can control how much fuel you're putting into the fire. You can turn up the speed of that auger and dump a bunch of fuel into the fire and have a hot, raging fire. Or you can slow the auger way down and just have a simmering fire that is just barely keeping going. And because of that, you have the option on most pellet stoves to attach a thermostat, a standard thermostat like any other furnace system would use. And that thermostat sends a signal to the stove when the room is too cool to turn up the heat. So the stove will cycle between a mode where it's burning pretty hard and putting off a whole lot of heat, and just idle, depending upon what the room needs. And so because of that, because it's thermostatically controlled, or it can be, and I would suggest that you set yours up this way, it will burn just the exact amount of wood necessary to maintain comfort in the home. And so, unlike a standard wood stove where you're shoveling wood into it, waiting for it to get real hot and then cool and then tending it again, and you have to be on top of it all day long, this just maintains itself all day, just does its thing. You don't have to pay any attention to it except throw a bag of pellets in once a day or so, and it just does its thing, and it maintains a nice even temperature in the house. The temperature in the house isn't going up and down and oscillating as the fire undulates. So I think the pellet stove is great in that way. It's also very safe because it's electronically controlled. If anything strange happens with the fire, the system turns the stove off automatically. The stove is warm, but you can put your hand on it without getting burnt. And so it just puts off a stream of hot air that heats up the room. The stove itself, except for the very front glass of it, is pretty cool to the touch, so it's very safe. Now, one of the downsides of the pellet stove is that, well, you have to buy pellets, and it takes a while to heat up the space. It doesn't make the entire stove a blazing hot thing that quickly heats up the room. It can take a few hours to get the room up to temperature. And so this is the sort of thing that you start up and let run for a while, and once the room is at temperature, it does a great job of maintaining it. But if the room is cold and you're starting up the stove, it's gonna take a while to get things comfortable. So those are some of the pros and cons of the different wood stoves. If you're using a stove for more long-term use and you're planning on burning it all night long to supplement your heat, or as your only heat source, I think the pellet stove is the way to go. It does a great job of maintaining even, steady heat all day long, and it's low maintenance. It's easy to handle the pellets. The pellets burn very efficiently, so you don't get a whole lot of ash. And the pellets aren't so dirty and awkward to handle as normal chunks of wood are. But on the other hand, if you want a stove that can quickly heat up the room, that you can burn all kinds of different wood material in. For example, if you're using it in your wood shop and you want to be able to burn all those little chunks of wood scrap that you create, standard wood stove might be the ticket for you. It'll heat up the room quickly, and so for short bursts of operation, standard wood stove is probably the way to go. But for long-term comfort and for additional supplemental heating, I think the pellet stove is hard to beat. Either way you go, it's probably a lot less expensive to keep your area comfortable and warm with wood heat than it is any other fuel source. And for me, I just love sitting by the fire, and I think there's just something ancestral about wood heat. We've been using wood heat for generations, and maybe it's just in our DNA that sitting by the fire is just so satisfying. So I hope you're keeping warm this winter season, and if you're contemplating getting a wood stove, well, maybe that guidance gave you a little bit of validation. Thanks for tuning in. If you like the video, I'd appreciate if you'd give me a thumbs up or subscribe if you haven't already, and I look forward to catching you on another episode.